Well, Mary, thank you, and Commissioner Paredes, thank you for inviting us here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've been following the work that's going on in Texas, and I applaud you for the progress you've made and the work you've done so far, not only in the finance policy area, but also in other aspects of higher education policy. I think we're all in this together, and it's a pleasure to see the work that's going on in other states and to learn also from what you're doing, that's ideas we can take back to Tennessee. I want to walk you through our outcomes-based funding formula and provide you with some details about how it works, some context for where it came from, and some of our implementation strategies and things we learned along the way that we think may be of help to other states as they consider something similar. As an overview for this, and all the slides are in the packet, by the way, I want to walk you through some major sections of what we're going to talk about over the next half hour or so. By the way, as we go through this, please stop me and ask me questions about aspects of this that you're curious about. Feel free to interrupt me, and let's have a conversation as we go. But we'll talk a little bit about where this idea came from and how it's distinguished from what we think of as the proper noun, capital P, capital F, performance funding. We'll talk about why this is significant within the higher ed policy arena, how we did this, the process that we engaged in for the better part of 2 years to make this happen. I'll have a short mathematical set of slides, and for those of you who are scared off by numbers, I promise it will not be that scary to follow. And talk about how it was implemented, our strategies for getting this put into place, and some of our reflections on its various strengths and weaknesses, why we think this is better than an enrollment-based approach, and why we went whole hog, as they say. We went the whole thing. So, where did this come from? The story starts back about 2 years ago, almost to the day. Our outgoing governor, Governor Phil Bredesen, was convening on a monthly basis a bipartisan group of education leaders who were really focused on two arenas, K-12 education reform and higher education reform. This was right on the cusp of the Race to the Top application, which Tennessee was lucky enough to be a recipient of. The governor had education on his mind and began to solicit ideas for what else he could include in a reform package, potentially, to the legislature that would make some higher ed and K-12 reforms. He wanted to link the two up because the legislature was sort of primed to think about reform in education, in the education arena. THEC, through our own Lumina MOA grant, was already thinking about doing something like an outcomes-based model. This is something that we've been toying with for several years, and we were on our own already developing some ideas. My boss, Dr. Rich Rhoda, our CEO, encourages the staff to think about creative things and try to find different ways to do things better, and so he encouraged us to keep thinking about this. And so one day during one of those bipartisan lunches the governor hosted, we took to him an idea, and he told us to get it on one slide. I don't want a presentation, I want one slide. And we took to the governor the basic outline of what eventually became the outcomes-based model. Simply no longer using enrollments, using outcomes with a weight structure to reflect institutional mission. The governor is a former healthcare executive. He instantly loved the idea. He thought it was an incredible incentive structure that would completely change the way our higher education institutions think about finance policy. He instantly liked it. And therefore, he included it in his proposals that eventually went to our legislature in January 2010. Those reforms were debated within a special session, January 2010, again, right before the K-12 Race to the Top application, but we were on the heels of that during the special session. And eventually, our legislature passed the Complete College Tennessee Act, whose text, I believe, is in the packets that Mary put together. Now, this legislation had several reform areas, some of which are consistent with the ideas, Commissioner, you were just mentioning, but the most important one, from my perspective at least, is the funding formula policy, the change to an outcomes-based model. Now, I'm going to violate one of the first rules of PowerPoint, which is to put lengthy text on the screen and ask you to read it, but this is important. This is what the charge was. They told us to consult with our two governing boards, the University of Tennessee System and the Board of Regents, to develop policies for a very fair and equitable distribution of our available public funds, consistent with the goals of our master plan. Similar to your completion goals, we have a goal to get our ed attainment levels to regional and national averages as well by the year 2025. Consistent with that goal, we are to develop an outcomes-based formula model. That's what we were to do. Very clear objective. So why is this significant? This should be fairly obvious, but I want to make sure we use make sure I go through a couple of points. Previously, much like every state has done for at least a half century, we had an enrollment-based model. That's how we did our finance distribution. We had incentives embedded throughout the model. For the most part, they were within the traditional performance funding program. In our case, it was an extra 5% add-on, and that's where we attached the quality question. The other 95% was enrollment, much like every other state. Obviously, therefore, the incentive is in one direction. It's enrollment, pure and simple. Bigger is better. Other states have begun to make progress incorporating outcomes into their models, but for the most part, that's occurring, again, within that small 5% performance funding box. We asked, why does that have to be that way? We think so far we're the only state to completely jettison our enrollment model in favor of the outcomes model, whose details I'll walk through in a second. Another key function that I'll show you is institutional mission. That's a critical piece of what we designed, and we think we found a fairly elegant way of incorporating mission into the model, at least one that I think our institutions are happy with. Some things this is not. This is not any reform to our 30-year history of performance funding. The first question I usually get on this is, well, are you still distributing 5% based on this outcomes model? The answer is no. Every dollar that our legislature appropriates to higher education for operations is based on the outcomes model, all $750 million worth. I know which pales in comparison to Texas, but every dollar we have goes through the outcomes model. There is simply no more enrollment-based allocation in Tennessee. First-time freshman who shows up on the University of Tennessee Knoxville's campus, nothing happens financially on the state side until they begin to trigger outcomes, until they begin to accumulate hours, hopefully get a degree, if they successfully transfer. Until those things happen, that's when money kicks in. The simple act of enrollment triggers nothing. And again, this is for the allocation of all funding. Every operational dollar that we distribute goes through this methodology. So how did we do this, and what was the process? We had a formula review committee, similar to what Texas has, that I convened, again, for about a year and a half. I had representatives from across the higher education structure and state government. I had about 20 folks in the room, and as I like to say, I had about 30 different opinions on every subject matter. But we had folks from every walk of life in on the meetings. And we consulted outside experts. I had Dennis Jones from NCHEMS practically on speed dial all the time, asking him, Dennis, am I on the right track here? Are we doing something that is only mildly crazy, or can we pull this off? Well, we consulted experts throughout. Again, broad membership, multiple meetings. This is something I'll talk a lot more about in a few slides. Explicit institutional feedback in this process. Without buy-in from them, this could not happen. I'll talk in detail about this. There are two major areas we asked for their feedback on, the two main design elements of the model. We had continuous briefings on background with constitutional officers, legislative staff, officials from UT, TBR institutions. We even had road shows. I would go out to campuses, find the biggest auditorium I can find, and get on stage and just tell people, here's what we're doing and why. People kept hearing an outcomes-based model, and it was perceived as something that would be a function purely of graduation rates, which scared people because of the access issue. Community colleges said, what about us? That's not what it was, but we had to fight some misperceptions. So we went on the road and talked to people about it. Each committee meeting came and dealt with a different element of the design. There was generally broad consensus on the fact that this was a prudent step for Tennessee to take. Shifting to outcomes, away from enrollment, made a lot of walking around sense to people. Details will work out, but that simple idea made a lot of sense. It resonated with people, resonated with the governor. And again, most folks thought that was better than enrollments. Our institutions, key role in this process. I had presidents, CFOs, provosts on my committee. I think over half of the committee were institutional representatives. At two key parts of the process, we directly asked them for feedback on what it is we were doing. The first step was, what outcomes should we include? If we do this, what should we count up? What should we measure? You'll see the details in a second, but they got feedback to give feedback on what it is they thought was important to their campus. This is a particularly fun exercise at the community colleges, whose mission, I would submit, is much more complex than the universities is. We also then asked them how they prioritize these outcomes. Obviously, schools like UT Knoxville or UT or at A&M, research is a much bigger deal. Doctoral degree production, a much bigger deal. Other schools are much more open access, have much less selective admissions. Therefore, the outcomes have to be weighted differently. You can't just plug in a number for each school and have it be a uniform policy established for every institution. So we therefore said, why can't we weight the outcomes differently? They don't have to mean the same thing at every campus. Again, sort of an intuitive appeal to that idea, something that had never really been in any sort of finance policy any state had ever tried. And this is where mission comes into play. This is where that weight structure, which I'll show you in a second, wraps around the mission of a campus, we think, to some degree, and allows it to be reflected in the finance policy. Another piece of this process was extensive data analysis. We back-tested every design we did for 3 years and showed folks, here's how this would have looked had we been doing this for the last 3 or 4 years. Schools would say to us, you're going to change the rules of the game, that's fine, but what is it you're going to do and how will it work? So we back-tested everything we did, and something that Sean will show you in a second, we also made a projection tool that looked forward and said, therefore, if schools did increase outcomes, if the measures we have chosen, the weights we've identified, if they were to increase, what impact does that have on the distribution? This was a very key feature of our process, giving folks comfort with the fact that what we were building, something from scratch, did in fact work and it behaved properly. Okay, the mathematical portion of the presentation. Here's how it works. Again, 2 main design features: the exclusive use of outcomes, again, no enrollments whatsoever, and a unique weight factor by campus that, again, tries to reflect the Carnegie classification, the mission of that campus. First thing we did, identify what outcomes we would include for our universities. I would submit these, you could come up with this list in about 34 seconds. They are student progression metrics. As a student accumulates hours towards a degree, outcomes get triggered. As they achieve a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or a doctorate degree, we just count those up. Research funding. Student transfer. Transfer was a key component of the Complete College Tennessee Act legislation. The committee wanted to reinforce those aspects of the legislation in the formula model. If a student successfully transfers to any of our schools, we count that as an outcome. And then 2 measures of efficiency: graduation rates and degrees per FTE. Yes, ma'am.
Universities and community college or universities?
Good question. We have 9 public universities, 13 community colleges, total enrollment head count, a little over 200,000.
How many university systems?
2. 3 of the 9 universities are within the University of Tennessee system, including UT Knoxville, our largest. The other 6 and all the community colleges are in the Tennessee Board of Regents. A couple of med schools in there, not under this methodology, vocational technical schools, other aspects, but those campuses are the ones primarily that adhere to this policy.
As you're going through this, is it true that Tennessee has a requirement that students attend community college before going to?
No, sir. No, sir. Now, I would submit that we probably would encourage them, much like Commissioner Paredes, you said, to do so if that fits their academic profile. We have transfer arrangements, dual admissions, 2+2 programs to try to encourage more to do so. It is not required, though, no. So we identified the outcomes. These 10 factors, and much of these things you can find in our fact book that we've been publishing for decades. These are just basic data that we collect all the time. We go out and get the actual data on those outcomes. All of this is for our flagship UT Knoxville. They produced 4,179 bachelor's degrees during the last academic year. We count those up and we put them in the model. The next thing we do is we provide a premium, a bonus, if you will, for certain outcomes that are produced from either a low-income student or an adult student. These populations were sort of broadly perceived to be important to every institution throughout our state. There were other possibilities, but these 2 were the easiest, and we had data for them. And so we count them extra in the model. It really works very simply. If you graduate 100 students, all of whom were low income, the model acts like you had 140 students who graduated. It just simply counts up more outcomes, and there's a bonus for those students.
Russ,
yes, sir.
An adult student is what age?
Divine 25 and up. Low income was Pell eligibility at any point during their college career.
How did you arrive at the 40%?
A little art more so than science. We had some data that suggested that the odds of graduation, if you will, was about 40% different for those types of students in a very broad sense than it was for a non-low-income student. That's a premium that we perhaps may toy with over time and calibrate it to wherever it should properly be constructed, but 40% was a nice number to start with. Yeah. I hope I don't trip over this cord halfway through. If I do, help pick me up here. Next thing we do is we have to rescale this data. You've got millions of research dollars on one hand. You've got a graduation rate in percentage terms. You've got things on very different scales. We have to get things comparable, turning things from ounces to pounds or feet to miles, just changing the scale of things so we can then multiply them times the weight. That scale factor is the same for everybody. We don't play around with those. We're just getting things on the same scale so we can compare them. Once we do that, we introduce the weight factor. And again, this is trying to reflect the mission of that campus. In UT Knoxville's case, we are basically saying, the state is basically saying to our flagship, it is very important for you to do graduate work, the production of master's and doctoral degrees. There's a combined 25% weight on those two factors. Their graduation rate is tremendously important at a 20% weight. You'll see other schools with less selective admissions have a much lower weight in a future slide. This is a weight structure that's supposed to reflect what it is they do and what the state will eventually pay for, more importantly. And then all we do is multiply the data times the weight. And that's essentially it. That's the one mathematical step. All these are identical at every university, except for the weights, of course, which again reflect mission. Once we do that, we have to monetize that in some way. We simply go out and grab an SRAB, average salary multiplier, monetize that final number. We add a few fixed cost elements to reflect square footage and those things. And then we add in our traditional performance funding program, an extra 5% that's really focused now on quality components. Everything we have is very quantitative, which is one of its weaknesses perhaps. The performance funding program is still focused on quality. It still has targets that schools have to meet and goals. If they achieve those, whole separate program, there's an extra 5%. But those are all the calculations. Everything fits on one slide. I think Mary had printed out the entire model for all of our universities. I think it prints on 2 pages. The entire calculation, everything we do, start to finish, is on 2 pages, which is an extraordinarily simpler way for state government to think about how it funds institutions. I want to focus a little bit on the weight structure itself. These are our 9 public universities, and they are arranged in basic Carnegie classification order. Austin Peay State University is the first one you see in the leftmost column. All the way to the right, our flagship UT Knoxville, a research extensive university. The weights you will see have what we refer to as very much a horizontal equity about them. As you move through the Carnegie classes, as schools become more and more complex, the weight on certain outcomes would either decrease or increase to reflect that. Research funding becomes a whole lot more important, obviously, as you move up the Carnegie classes. You'll notice the 6th line down, doctoral degrees, becomes more and more important as you move through the Carnegie classes. Bachelor's degrees gets crowded out a little bit, not less important, but it gets crowded out somewhat and has a lower weight. When we asked our presidents for that second piece of their feedback, we asked them to prioritize these outcomes. These numbers per se aren't important. What's important is the relative order of them, the relative order of the outcomes. Our president said, our UT Knoxville president said, research is one of their reasons for being. It's got a high weight. Other schools said they much more focus on producing the next generation of nurses and teachers, etc., and therefore bachelor's degrees is their primary factor, and that's their primary weight. But these have some vertical equity, reflecting the priority the campus presidents identified, reflecting Carnegie class, and again, some horizontal equity. It makes sense when you line them up, the weights tend to increase or decrease as the outcome changes in importance. Our community colleges. Same basic structure, so in the interest of time, I won't belabor it, but I will focus on a couple of slides. The first one is the identification of the outcomes. Again, student progression. As a student accumulates hours, they begin to trigger outcomes. The simple active enrollment, again, no longer matters, but as they accumulate hours, outcomes are triggered. Dual enrollment. If they were to take a dual enrollment class, that's an outcome our community colleges are shooting for. It's in the model. The traditional associate's degrees, certificates, those are in here. Job placements. One of the residues of our long-standing performance funding program is we've been collecting data for decades on job placements from our community colleges. They know that already, been collecting it for years. We have now moved that from a small element of the 5% performance funding into the main part of the model. Remedial success. If a student successfully completes a remedial course and then can translate that into the successful completion of a college-level course, we count that as an outcome. That's a success. Transfer, workforce training measured in contact hours with local businesses, and an awards per FTE in lieu of a graduation rate, which we took off the table pretty quickly in the development of their model. These intermediate steps are the same. We gather data, award the premium for low-income and adults, scale it, introduce the weight, make the multiplication. All steps identical at the community colleges, but for the weights, same process as universities. And again, it all fits on one slide. We have 13 of these schools. About $200 million ballpark figure is appropriated every year to this sector. The weight structure, a little bit different for this sector because there's no Carnegie class to rely on. Instead, our community college president said, here's what my local community needs me to be doing. So some schools selected workforce training, job placements, certificate production as their top priorities. We assigned a uniform weight to whatever top priority they identified. Pellissippi State Community College is located 10 miles from UT Knoxville, our flagship. They really exist for student transfer, for the associate's degree production. They identified those outcomes as their top priorities. They received that 20% weight. Whatever the president said, this is what my community needs, this is what we do for our local area, this is how we prioritize these outcomes, that was the weight that we applied. All of these outcomes, except of course for graduation rate, are counts. These are not rates. These are not cohort dependent. We don't go through and identify an initial cohort of freshmen and start tracking them through. We look through an entire academic year in our student data system. If we can see the outcome achieved, we count it. Whether it was from a returning student who came back from 10 years ago, a part-time student who took 5 years to get to their 24-hour benchmark, or a first-time freshman who completed 45 hours in a year. Doesn't matter. If we can see the outcome in an academic year, we count it. Doesn't matter how the student got there. There's no cohorts. There's no rates. All of this, of course, is dependent upon our ability to see the data. We have a statewide student information system that's robust, it's long-standing. It allows us to make all this happen. That's a key feature. And again, one beauty of this and what distinguishes it from a performance funding program is that there's no goals, there's no targets. No one is saying to a campus, you have to hit this number that we in Nashville picked for you or else. Instead, they just simply count up outcomes like we counted up enrollments. And importantly, each institution's calculation is independent of anyone else's. There's no max on what you can achieve. There's no one, it's not like if you get the target in performance funding, we stop counting points and you're maxed out. The more you achieve, the better. We're just counting up new outcomes. Every school is independent. When it comes to the allocation, of course, that is competitive. We have limited state resources. The allocation is therefore a function of what the government can give higher education for operations. We follow a pro-rata distribution. Last year, our state government allocated about 58% of what we calculated and asked for. We simply prorate that out to 58% of each school's recommendation. That's where we're going. That, of course, means, and this is perhaps the most controversial feature of this, every state dollar is back up for grabs every year. There is no minimum entitlement amount of money for operations. There's no base level. You have to earn everything from the ground up every year. Now, this is where campuses get really nervous because they assume that, therefore, this must be quite volatile and that they have at risk tremendous amounts of money in any given year. We got around that by, A, properly designing the model, and Sean will demonstrate that, in fact, we think we've achieved that. In that projection tool, we can look forward to what happens under certain scenarios. We can show this is still fairly stable. For one thing, funding is now a function of 10 different numbers rather than a single number, enrollment. It's no longer subject to enrollment ups and downs based on economic conditions. This is not a budgeting tool. Of course, like most states, no one is saying from THEC's perspective, here's how you spend your money. Again, no targets, no goals. And excellence no longer overshadowed by enrollment growth. Our community colleges particularly, they didn't quite high-five each other, but they were close. There are so many things they do within their mission that no one has ever acknowledged. in a funding formula, the fact that they can get students through a remediation sequence, the fact that they successfully place graduates in jobs, dual enrollment. No one's ever said, let's fund on those things anymore on a large-scale basis, but now we are. They no longer have to chase warm bodies. Commissioner, you mentioned some institutional behavior purely a function of and a reaction to state finance policy. Classic example right here. Same dynamic as we have in Tennessee that you've illustrated in Texas. So how is this implemented? In a word, carefully and slowly. Of course, the stability is key, no longer being a function of one variable, function of 10 variables. And I'm going to attempt a graphic here. So we know, based on historical data, based on what our campuses look like, that eventually schools will perform differently, of course, and the outcomes model will take them off, and schools will diverge in their funding levels over time. That's what, in fact, is supposed to do. The enrollment model was on a different trajectory. The implementation strategy really was to have the outcomes model kind of start where the old enrollment model left off last year, a seamless transition between the two. So there's very little disruption in the short term, in the near term, between what you were receiving from your enrollment model and what you are now receiving from your outcomes model. To put that in numbers for you, these are our universities. The first column is what we estimated they would have received were we still doing enrollment versus what they did actually receive from the outcomes model, showing, for the most part, very little difference. Our largest institution is MTSU, Middle Tennessee. Enrollment they would have had acknowledged in the enrollment model, backed off that a year, so that's why you see a decline there. But for the most part, a fairly seamless transition.
As part of your presentation, you're going to talk about the impact that this had on admissions.
Yes, sir, we will. In fact, let me address that now. There has been, I would say, an unleashing of some energy across our campuses to think about things they ought to do differently, different ways to do student services. How do they attack admissions decisions? How do they structure, for instance, the residential environment? All these things that they have always wanted to potentially reform, they now have good reason to, because this is a large-scale efficiency incentive model. If you're spending money unwisely, this is going to bite you. So schools have begun to gather their senior staff, their student affairs professionals, their deans of departments, and said, how should we go about doing our business differently? Certain schools have said, we perhaps may want to tighten admissions. They don't necessarily have an incentive to do so because of those weights. If I can go back to the slide here.
40%.
Let's see. If you notice the bottom line, the graduation rate weight, and the fourth number, the bachelor's degree number, and sort of follow those across. In every case, there is a far greater incentive on the number of degrees rather than the graduation rate per se, until you get to the schools that are more selective in admissions and that have as part of their identity a high graduation rate number. And so schools have now said, we don't have to sacrifice access for funding on the far left side. Now, our flagship may say, you know what, getting our graduation rates up to a level of a UVA, University of North Carolina, may be important enough to perhaps tighten up admissions. But for the most part, we think we've avoided that potential problem with the way the weight structure was created. Does that address your question, Senator?
Question.
Yes, sir.
When you compare the enrollment and the outcomes-based model, those percentage changes are very small. Did y'all anticipate that they would be that small?
Yeah, it was designed that way. Mm-hmm.
And can you explain that a little better?
Yeah, sure. Basically, well, when you're creating something brand new with all these new numbers, the math doesn't know where to start. We sort of programmed it, designed it. I'm an engineer by training, so your civil engineering has inspired me here. Engineered it as such to where the calculations, I don't want to say we backed into anything, we didn't do that, but we knew that we wanted to have these small disruptions in year number one. So as we were putting together the weights and the scales and the whole package, we had an idea of what would be a minimally disruptive model, and engineered it that way to, for the most part, ensure that this would be achieved, knowing full well that as we go forward years and as you compound differences over time, the outcomes model will shoot off in a different direction by campus. In year number one, though, it was an exceedingly difficult just design process to get it to work like this. Sean and my other staff member, Scott, spent a lot of hours making this work in Excel.
So did you do that by adjusting the weights or the
Some.
priorities or?
Priorities, no. Weights, yes. For instance, this is why the specific number of the weight per se is not as important as how it ranks in priority order. In other words, there was nothing magical about someone saying that those weights ought to be 5, 10, 15, or 20. What did matter was their relative priority orders so much. So we could say, for instance, well, let's make 20, 25. It's still their top priority, but we can therefore minimize its disruption, get it implemented in a much easier way, and therefore, solve one problem at least.
Are these weights, will they be able to change these weights? How often?
Yeah, good question. I envision, and to the extent that this will be up to me, they will not tweak these every year. One of the beauties of this approach, though, is it allows for changes to be made. If a campus were to say, we now need to be doing something different in our community, or if their Carnegie class changes, for instance, we have a readily available way to reflect that difference in mission by adjusting the weights. So periodically, every 3 to 5 years, we think we ought to take a hard look at what the weights ought to be. The state may say, we now want our community colleges to be doing something different, whatever it is. We have a readily available way of making that happen. You pick out the outcome, you gather data, and you give it a weight, and you move forward. And so I don't envision on a year-to-year basis tweaks, but over time, part of its beauty, I think, such as it is that it is adjustable and can reflect changes in mission and profile. Let's see, where were we? Strengths and weaknesses. Again, multiple measures of success now accounted for. Nothing in the model says how a campus is to achieve its greater productivity. It's up to the campus president and his or her staff. No failure to achieve predetermined goals. Mission is key. We think those weights pass the smell test. If a campus were to look at its Carnegie class, its profile, its mission statement, and then you go look at those weights, it just makes a lot of sense. You can see that certain things are more important than others. That fits a campus's mission. We think that's one of the virtues of this approach. Again, it's flexible. It can accommodate changes either at the state level or the campus level in mission and in profile in a very easy and fairly elegant way. And it's more transparent and simpler for state government. When we finished a presentation much like this, our House Finance Chair said this was deceptively simple, which I'm reasonably confident he meant as a compliment. But it fairly is easy to follow, we think. There is no black box aspect to this, we don't think. Again, every calculation you've seen on the screen today. We get 10 data points, and we can run our model in about 2 minutes. Another virtue, this is linked directly to our educational attainment and completion goals. We're trying to get Tennessee up to regional and national averages of educational attainment. Access is still important to us and a virtue, but our primary policy objective now is people finishing with a credential, with a degree. It's linked directly to what we call our public agenda. And again, this establishes a framework, we think, for an ongoing policy conversation. State government groups like this can have continuous policy conversations about what it values and what it ought to be funding and how you reflect mission. And you can easily make adjustments to the structure to make or to reflect those changes in the conversations. The specific outcomes that we chose, the weights that we chose, were unique to Tennessee's context. I would submit that the main virtue of this for another state who is looking for an idea is the structure provides a way for you to design a model specific to the needs of Texas. Nothing magical about our outcomes. You identify your outcomes, figure out how mission would be reflected in your weights, and you have a ready-made structure to fold that in a very simple methodology that can probably then be fine-tuned to minimize implementation differences in year number one, that you can make it work fairly readily mathematically. I'm going to frame the disadvantages in terms of things we heard from our institutions. I've had countless conversations with most every president across Tennessee about things they are worried about. And here are some of them. How flexible will it be? Will we change things on an annual basis? Or if their Carnegie class changes, will we acknowledge that in the model? Things of that nature. What unintended consequences will there be? I don't know. I think we've tried to wring all that out of the system. We've tried to solve the access issue. We've tried to solve the institutional mission issues. We've tried to solve the problem with having rates. We instead are using counts to avoid cohort definitional problems. And really, at its core, have we been effective at trying to reflect mission with the use of that weight structure? We think we have, but that's something that I don't think anyone's ever really tried before, but we've at least made an attempt to reflect mission into the basic workings of a model and in a very straightforward way. But that's a concern our campuses have, is did we properly reflect their mission? The balance between stability and volatility. I had several folks at the legislative level tell us that that slide we saw with minimal differences in year one, don't worry about that. If it happens to slice 5-10% from a campus in year one and shifts 10% money to another campus, so be it. Other people thought that was crazy. So we're trying to balance a stability-volatility dynamic. You can see which side won out. This is heavily quantitative. This is one of its weaknesses. We have had, and as a faculty member, I'm concerned about issues of quality. And is there now incentive for faculty to simply move people through this system? My basic response is I think I trust our faculty too much to make that happen. And if there were that going on, if those things were going on, I think we would see that in licensure pass rates, in student satisfaction surveys, in program accreditation, things that are in our performance funding program that are in addition to this outcomes model. We would see those early warning signs. So I'm not as worried about that as others are. And a big one, this last one, that outcomes are largely a function of the student input. We think we've addressed that with, again, counting events rather than measuring rates of, to avoid schools potentially trying to shrink their freshman class to get the graduation rate higher to get more money. We think we've avoided that. And final two wrap-up slides, just some philosophical thoughts we've held with us as we've gone through this process. From an institutional perspective, it is quite fair to say state government ought to be very clear in what it wants from institutions. However, they should have wide latitude to pursue those means academically, programmatically, in all matters as they see fit, with minimal interference from state government. Set a goal, that's fine. Let us figure out how to make that happen. And provide incentives for us, that's fine. Don't interfere with how we judge the best way forward for my campus, for our campus, to make those outcomes happen. Government, though, of course, is asking, in this economic environment, what's the best way we as state government can allocate taxpayer dollars to institutions? What's the most effective means possible? What decision or what data do we need to make those decisions? And how can we do those in a way, again, that is a hands-off approach that minimizes interference, that encourages campuses to do the things that the state needs it to do? Those were sort of our philosophical foundations we went through as we built this whole model. All this, again, is in your packet, and all this is on our webpage. The model itself, PowerPoints, explanatory files, everything's out there. Well, that concludes my part. Questions, Don?
Yeah, real question. So when you were describing the trying to minimize the difference between, or the transition between enrollments to outcomes, you said that the staff was really working with the kind of not the weighting, but the different values and more.
Yeah.
But the institutions chose the priorities, which determined the relative weights. Was there any role for the institutions? In other words, did they say, well, we're going to try, these are our priorities, and then, oops, that doesn't look so good, so let me identify another set of priorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, because they knew from the front end, we were transparent about the fact that we were going to try to engineer it to hit where the old model left off. In other words, even if they did try to play with the priorities to try to get a higher number, we were going to engineer it back to where it roughly started where the old one left off. We don't want anyone to play games on the front end, so we wrung that out of the system pretty early. Yeah, as best we could. Yes, sir.
Do you have any trend data yet in terms of success? Are graduation rates trending up, transfer rates?
Some of them are. Now, of course, it's early. This has been in use 1 year. So the 2011-12 was the first year we've had it. We have seen, for instance, we have had about a 40% increase in our community colleges in the number of short-term certificate programs that they're starting up. For one thing, reflecting economic needs, local workforce needs. Also now, though, that's an outcome in the model. They get rewarded for that, and so they're responding to the incentives, no longer chasing enrollments per se. So there's some initial signs, yes, that it is a new incentive structure, creating new behaviors, but it's still very early. Yes.
Did the state provide any hold harmless funding for those 4 or 5 institutions that lost funding?
Good question. Well, another feature of this is we are, in fact, removing completely our hold harmless policy. The short version of this is we had states in the enrollment model, some funded at 70% of their enrollment need, others at, say, 45 to 50%. We were unwilling as a state over the last 10, 15 years to reallocate money to reflect enrollment differences. As part of the implementation of this, alongside it, is to get that pro-rata distribution back where it is, in fact, equal. One thing that our governor did do was, for the schools who were primarily hit by that policy, removing the hold harmless, he did provide some one-time money to soften the blow. That's independent of any of this stuff, but he did do that for a year. There were a couple of schools who were losing about 5 to 10% of their funding due to the correction of that hold harmless problem. And he wanted to soften that blow. Yeah. So some one-time money for that, yes.
Could you just talk for a minute, maybe speculate a scenario where you have a state like Texas that has a fairly rapidly expanding demographic population in Bauman College students, and as our legislative friends mentioned, the amount of money is probably going to go down.
Yes.
And how will this model react to that scenario?
That's a great question. Well, for instance, the schools who would be experiencing rapid enrollment increases that would translate into productive enrollments, into outcomes, would command a greater share of resources in Tennessee, for instance. Those who did not would not. And so the money is drawn to the places that are, in fact, producing more things. If those things are a production of more enrollments, so be it. Money is drawn to them. If you have a school declining in enrollment, producing fewer degrees, fewer research, money will be drawn from them. So it works on the way up and the way down. One problem, of course, in Tennessee is and everywhere else, we're not fully funded, and so money is competitive and it's limited. But this is a much more efficient, we think at least, way for state government to allocate resources to those schools that are, in fact, being more productive with their outcomes.
So if everybody improves their outcomes, which would be a desirable goal,
Sure.
They're still going to divide up a similar proportion of the pie.
Yes, yes. And in fact, on that point, one of the things that Sean will show you in a second is that it has been engineered to be fair, and that is, if every school is sort of a rising tide lifts all boats equally, then the funding won't really change. It stays where it is. Now, until you then see differences in productivity, and then the money will shift.
So when people talk about this around the country, I do think it's fair to say that the innovations that they'll highlight is, let's say, the outcomes that are compiled through the deliberations of the institutional leaders and the weighting of those outcomes. But they'll also point to the engagement of the institutions and the online tools and that kind of thing. And the narrative he tells is pretty compelling, and it sounds like it's sort of a smooth story from beginning to end, which I don't really buy. So,
fair enough.
So, can you talk about, so what were the major points of friction along the way, or what were things that you thought were going to work a certain way or be received a certain way by the institutions that then you say, we shouldn't have done it that way? I mean, so what were some of those things?
A couple things. And I characterize it that way, Harrison, too, because I think for the state to have moved so quickly and so holistically to this in a way without, at the end of the day, people accepted it. And so overall, I describe it that way. But it's fair. There were, for instance, we have several schools, and I won't name names, who are still convinced that for some reason I have it out for UT, for the TBR system, and I am doing this for UT Knoxville, that somehow I'm trying to play favorites with certain campuses, which I'm not quite sure why they get that, but they think we're manipulating the numbers to make that happen. There was concern about graduation rates. They said graduation rates are not a fair measure, and they pointed to all the deficiencies in the metric and why it's no longer really representative of the quality of the campus. All those things were great, but we kept saying, if we were to go back to our legislature and say we developed an outcomes-based model that ignored university graduation rates, we couldn't get through the door. We had to somehow get that in the model. Appropriately weighted, I would submit, and appropriately weighted to reflect mission. But there were some realities that we thought we had to put into the model that our campuses in some way objected to. There are schools who say, we've been telling them for years, grow, baby, grow, and now we're telling them don't do that anymore. And so we're changing the rules on them. legitimate beef, legitimate objection, getting back to the minimizing the implementation, trying to make it a smooth transition. There are schools who don't think we still correctly captured mission. They say, I don't want the weights to be what my mission is now. I want it to be what my aspirational mission is. That also, from the legislative perspective, didn't fly. Schools are what they are. Their profile is what it is. If in the future, if they were to move up in a Carnegie class, if we were to suddenly expect different things from certain campuses, we can make that happen. But at least right now, at its birth, it'll reflect who campuses actually are, not what they think they would want to be in the future. Campus aspiration was a big problem. That's off the top of my head, but those are some of the friction points we had. I would say on the outcomes themselves, none of those are really controversial. Those are pretty easy. The weights are more difficult. Yes, sir.
Question, as it relates to the dollars that you have, of those, and then the distribution of them based on the outcome model, are they just for tuition and fees, or are they for capital programs?
Operating only. State fund operating only. Tuition dollars stay with our campuses, so those are independent. About 2/3 of our total, what we call education in general, E&G funding is tuition, so we're dealing with 1/3 of the deck here. Capital funding is separate and direct. Yeah, this is operations only. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. When we have talked about creating a model like this in the past, we talked about, you said about this being a quantitative rather than a qualitative, and you brought up the point about licensures and student feedback. Not many bachelor's degrees have a licensure exam. Has there been any discussion in Tennessee about how to somehow fit a qualitative testing structure or something into the mix to see if there's anything, if there are better student outcomes from this new model?
Short answer is no. I would say that's sort of something we always kind of think about in a certain way, but there's been no serious effort, I would say, no progress made towards incorporating that aspect into this. If, though, speaking of the unintended consequences, if we suddenly saw campuses stop trying to produce engineers and chemists and physicists and start producing Bachelor of Philosophy, no offense, Harrison, then perhaps we would say, now there's something with this we ought to step back and look at what campuses are producing and the quality of those degrees. But unless that happens on a large scale, I think we're still in a trust, wait and see mode with that. Yes, sir.
Don't you still have the 5%?
We do, yeah, which does directly relate to those things, and that is a point of pride for our campuses. It's been going on for 30 years. Campuses tout the fact that they scored a 96 on their performance funding. That's a big deal spiritually, if you will, for the campus. So yeah, that does matter a lot, absolutely. There's another aspect of this, which I'm going to ask Sean Tierney on my staff to go through with you. This is our dynamics model. This is the projection tool. This is a tool that lets campuses construct what-if scenarios. If we were to produce 100 more bachelor's degrees at a campus, while the big research UT is doing $50 million more research, but yet someone else raised their graduation rates by 5%. If all that's going on at once, what happens to the money? And where does it go? And how do the weights and the outcomes, how does all this filter through the calculations and actually change the distribution of dollars? I'm going to ask Sean to go through this on the screen and to kind of walk you through a couple of scenarios and things that we think this dynamics model helps make our case.
This behind us is the dynamic model. There were 3 goals in constructing this. First, to show that the formula is stable, that it doesn't wildly shift money around from year to year. Second, that it rewards institutions and does what it's supposed to do, which is to put money where the success and improvements are, especially as they relate to institutional mission. And third, that it would be a planning tool for administrators so that they could, as for us suggested, project what would happen if all of these numbers are moving at once, and so that they could plug in trends and see what the general appropriations would be for next year. I think there was also one other key outcome from this all, which was that it really helped us in terms of buy-in and transparency. We wanted to have a very simple, intuitive model, and everyone thought that was all well and good, but they wanted to wait off a little bit and see what happens to the money. And I think once we were able to show what will happen to the money, we got a lot more buy-in. we actually went around the state presenting this model at different institutions. And after a few months, we actually started going to presentations where most of the audience had already seen this and downloaded it from our website and played with it, so they were able to ask us specific questions. They really understood the formula in a way that we never really thought they would pick up on so quickly. And we're going to be scrolling left and right and up and down. This can be a little bit of a small screen sometimes. But what we do is well, we start with the instructions, but since I'm here, I think we'll skip that for now. The second tab is the outcomes, which is where you can plug in a projected increase or decrease at any metric for any university or community college. As Russ just set up, Columbia State just had an increase of 10% in associates and certificates. Up at the top, you can select 2 institutions, 1 community college and 1 university, to look at in more detail at one time. And so after that increase at Columbia State, we can see that their projected change in appropriations is about $23,000, or about 0.2%. Meanwhile, Austin Peay, by virtue of staying stagnant and other colleges moving up, will lose about $1,100, which is really a negligible amount, which is another feature of this dynamic model, that it shows that if one institution was to increase rapidly, it wouldn't take money all from one institution. That increase would really be kind of split up among all of the institutions, so that it would almost be negligible what other institutions would lose overall. Of course, as years go on and changes compound, if you don't keep up with everyone else, you are going to fall behind, and those small decreases are going to add up. Now, we also wanted to show that for the universities, we actually have increases along Carnegie classification, as Russ has already indicated. Now, if we scroll down, I think we'll get to the universities. Yep. Let's take bachelors and associates. Since Austin Peay has a higher emphasis on bachelors than other universities, if they were to increase by, say, 10% or so, we would see, if we zero those out first, we would see that Austin Peay increased by about 0.8% in overall appropriations. Now, if we were to go down and say Tennessee Tech was to increase by 10% for bachelors, they have a smaller weight, I think only 25%. Let's see what happened if Tech would only increase about 0.6%, again, because less of their weight is associated with bachelor's degrees. So they'll gain a lot more with improving other metrics, but not as much when they improve bachelor's degrees. Now let's go all the way to the right to University of Tennessee, Knoxville. They have much smaller emphasis on bachelor's degrees. So even if they increase by the same amount, 10%, they would not gain as much funding because they have emphasis on other outcomes. As you can see, they only increase by about 0.3%. So that really shows what Russ has been alluding to, which is that you are rewarded based upon how you fulfill your institutional mission, and that if you increase along with the metrics that you're supposed to be emphasizing, you will be getting more money than if you increase on metrics that you're not particularly emphasizing. Now, we also programmed in some macros just to make it easier for us. The first two, they reset everything to 0 in case you've been typing in different numbers. The second one's increase everything by 1%. The next increase everything by 2%. I think Russ has just increased everything by 2%. And again, we wanted to show that a rising tide moves up all boats. If everyone was to increase 2% in every metric, there wouldn't be a whole lot of money shifting around. As you can see, there's a little pocket change, $5,000 here, $3,000 there, but that's really negligible money. So if everyone was to increase their outcomes at the same rate, money wouldn't shift around. money starts to shift around only when institutions increase or decrease greatly based relative to everyone else. Sure. Sure. So what Russ has just programmed in is that Middle Tennessee State has just increased every single metric by 10%, whereas everyone else has only moved up 2%. So as you would expect, MTSU should be running away with more funding. And sure enough, everyone else has decreased by about 0.2%, whereas MTSU has increased by about 2%. Again, MTSU isn't drawing money from any one particular institution. It's very distributed overall. But if MTSU is going 8% above and beyond everyone else, they deserve to be getting more appropriations, and sure enough, they are.
I have a question, Sean.
Sure.
For the funding, does your funding, the way the legislature hands it out to higher ed, all together, so your community colleges and your universities are funded in one kind of lump sum that's allocated?
They are not. In the future, the community colleges will be funded that way. But for the time being, the universities are and continue to be, and the community colleges are funded individually. So whatever we request for an institution, that's how they'll be funded.
Oh, line item by campus. Okay. But as far as the formula, the way, how much that line item comes out to be, is the formula driven for everybody together?
Correct.
Yeah, so that, for instance, that MTSU number, that is the extra money they would receive in a flat budget environment if they had that increase, whereas everyone else would be at 2%.
The question she's really asking is, in Texas, there's an allocation for community colleges.
Yeah.
But in your case, there's an allocation for higher education.
No, there's an allocation by campus. So the legislature would say that's the amount of money Austin Peay gets in ETSU by campuses.
So at some point, there's no determination. I mean, how do they know that how much money there is for all these institutions?
Well, there's a bottom line number they can come up with from state general fund appropriations after they've really done healthcare and K-12, that they say, here's what's left for higher ed. Here's what we can do for you.
Okay, so it is essentially one pot, unlike two.
Well, it's an overall pot, and then we tell them, here's how we recommend you as the legislature allocate that money by campus. And so in the budget, in the budget document, it's by campus. Yeah. Now we will be moving to the community colleges being funded as a sector, so there'll be in the budget a community college line item appropriation for the whole sector. But for right now, it's each campus. In the budget, you can go and see the actual appropriation by campus.
The last thing before we move on to a different tab is that we also have programmed in projected increases or decreases in state appropriations. And here is, I think, what a lot of people want to see, what happens if the overall appropriations changes. Now, if we were to move up, increase total appropriations by about 1%, that MTSU number, it jumps up by 1%, so now they're gaining 3%, but everyone else has moved into positive territory as well. So as you can see, another aspect of this program that we really wanted to show was it really takes a minimal amount of money to really fund these increases. In a flat funding environment, you're necessarily going to be shifting around money from one to the other, but if we were able to just get a minimal amount, 0.5%, 1% in appropriations, we could fund most of these changes. And I think that's been really palatable in bringing forward to the legislature.
Could you show like a 15% decline?
Sure.
Something more realistic, you're saying?
Yeah. What happens?
In a 15% decline, it continues to be basically even across the board.
MTSU would take a smaller proportional reduction in this case, but yeah, the money gets shifted around where it ought to be.
Now, are there other sources of funds to the institutions that are outside the formula?
Small. There are, this is about a $750 million pot. There's probably $25 million in various centers of excellence, state fee waiver for military, things like that. But almost everything is in that pot.
So no separate facilities, line item, or anything like that?
When our capital is funded separately as a direct line item, in the event we ever get capital funding. And that's been hard to come by in recent years.
Okay, so no ongoing facilities formula or anything like that?
No.
So facilities, maintenance, and daily operations is funded through this formula?
Daily operations in a very generic sense, yes. Anything that rises to even a new roof, a capital project, is in that separate process, a separate capital funding process. We request capital maintenance, new outlay, operations, all alongside each other every November.
In Texas, high-cost programs such as engineering get more money than low-cost programs. But for looking at this model, there's no such differentiation. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, Harrison, you mentioned earlier about where the weak parts here. This is one of them. In fact, we have campuses who insist that that's a major problem. Two general responses to that. First is that those differences tend to even out across our campuses. For every campus who says they focus on a high-cost healthcare group of programs, other schools have the engineering focus. I mean, everybody's got their programs that are higher cost. So the differences are really minimal if you really look at it overall. And even the schools who say, like our engineering school is Tennessee Tech University. I think about maybe 10% of its annual bachelor's degree production is in engineering, even though it's our biggest one. So the vast bulk of what they do is still not in a traditional high-cost program. But if there were a change we were to make in the near future, I think I would try to find a way to acknowledge high-cost programs somehow, some way.
Look at it as a weighting factor or as a base multiplier?
Probably as at that premium. We'd attack it that way. For every engineering graduate, STEM graduate, plus 25%, some number. Yeah, that's a very clean way to do it. Sorry, Sean.
No, go ahead. I think the last tab we might focus on is the dynamic formula. And this tab attempts to show basically all of the numbers that flow through a particular institution's calculation. So, for example, we have Columbia State Community College. These are all of the numbers that flow through its total calculation. As Russ showed you earlier, we have the data, we have the subpopulations, we scale them, we take that scaled data, multiply it by the weights, take those weighted outcomes, total them up, and here is, we talked about earlier how this formula is about 80%. The other 20% is here on the right. It's the fixed costs, equipment and M&O costs. There's a phase-in factor as this formula gets geared up. And then there's the traditional 5% performance funding that we have, as well as legislative initiatives. So we take all of that, we calculate it all up, and we come up with the estimated recurring appropriations. So institutions can do this for everyone and kind of estimate what they would project to see based upon what their trends are, what other institutions' trends are, what they project future appropriations to be, and they found it to be not only a helpful tool in planning, but also in understanding how the formula will actually work in the real world.
I noticed some significant differences in the column that had the scale, I guess, weight or percentage or whatever it was. Is that kind of where you engineered to come up with a fairly even funding, the scale?
There is some aspect to getting the bottom line right to this, but primarily the main goal of the scales is if you took all of the system-wide outcome data as an overall group and ran through the scales, the scaled numbers are all, they're not the same, but they're very comparable. That was the main goal. It helped, though, that scale factor and the weights helped us get it where it was engineered properly. But really, let's try to get it all comparable. Yeah.
Because the scales are the same for
Scales are the same for everybody.
That's right.
Yeah. Just putting things in different units, basically, is all it's doing. Yeah.
Are there any other questions on the dynamic model?
Just tell me how you took this into account, if you did. In our situation, if right now we're funded on contact hours based on 12th class day at census.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to go to a completion model, we would lose, say, 20% funding on that. However, right now we receive 0 for our transfer students. So if you gave us credit for transfer students, automatically we would get X amount of dollars. Mm-hmm. So how do you account for that kind of thing, an automatic award for something that we're already doing?
Yeah. Well, my reaction to set of facts you just put on the table is that there is a mathematical way to account for everything you're doing, moving away from, in our case, 14th day census state, incorporating transfers, doing all those other things, and have it be revenue neutral, as they say. There's a mathematical way to do all that. If Texas were to make the shift tomorrow and take your data and run it through something like this, there is a solution out there to that problem. So I would submit you wouldn't have to take a 20% immediate cut, nor should you. And you could then have the funding acknowledging your transfers. This wasn't set up, I promise. So there's a mathematical solution to that, I would submit.
But that's
that would solve that
based
problem.
on going to 100%.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Dropping enrollment total.
And based on the principle that Tennessee incorporated, that it ought to be minimally disruptive, which may not be the case. I mean, states may want to say, you know what, let's have some immediate disruption. Let's move the money around now. That's a judgment call.
That's one of the things that's attractive about the model that we've talked about before. It is that giving us credit, financial credit, if you will, for transfers.
Absolutely.
Which is a qualm for us, too, that we always try to account for, because if it is a major goal for us, our students to transfer, but at the same time, when they transfer, we lose money because we don't have them enrolled. Ultimately, I mean, we want them to stay and graduate. It's hard to make that balance when overall, you know, you're going to have less money next year, regardless of what you do.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
You have pretty good knowledge, I'm sure, of the institutions in your state and how they historically operated. Have you tried to use the dynamic model to see what that might look like 5-10 years out based upon their historical operations?
We have.
How much diversion in funding do you see?
Fairly significant. It depends upon which particular school you look at and how much of a time frame you give it, and assuming that everything else stays static and they don't, in current trends or future trends. If you look over a 5-year period, I mean, 10, 15% shifting in funding. If you look longer, even more than that. A piece of evidence to this, removal of our old hold harmless that we applied to our enrollment model. When we undid that after 15 years of application, we shifted at a maximum about 15 to 20% funding by campus. And so if that's a guide, then the next 10 years, if you see similar trajectories of outcomes, you can see significant changes in the state appropriations by campus.
But that is
Which one would be winners? Well, the way it's engineered now is everyone's starting from the same starting point. And so it assumes purely however they perform in the future. It's just hard to say.
But I'm saying under this scenario of trying to project out this 5
Yeah.
10 years, based on current.
Yeah, there are some of our, in the middle Carnegie classes, have had some really healthy increases in graduation rates lately, which is a good thing. They would be benefited by this. We have Austin Peay State University right next to Fort Campbell, a military base, which has seen significant enrollment increases in bachelor's degree production. They're trending in the right direction. I mean, every school has a good case to make, but some have more to work with starting out than others, that's for sure. Yeah, but at least mathematically they start at the same point.
If the legislature historically has provided full harmless funding from enrollment changes, why don't you think they provide it for this as well?
Well, historically the legislature refused to shift money to reflect necessary changes in enrollments. That got to a critical mass, and the representatives of the institutions who were losing money that they otherwise rightfully would have had if we were shifting money said we've got to stop. And so there's a general consensus now among the legislature, even among our two governing boards, that if you have a hold harmless, if you don't shift money, you effectively have no finance policy, and you might as well have no incentive structure. And so there's a sort of a gentleman's agreement, I'll say, that's how they're going to do it going forward, and they did it this past year. The non-recurring money for one time was just simply look, let's soften the blow for this 1 year because we know we're making a big change on you.
In our Texas Senate, we have 31 members, and 30 of them have a 4-year university education.
Oh, yeah, similar dynamic in Tennessee. Yeah. Well, you know, it's an awkward conversation. We've been in meetings, and I'll talk to our community college presidents, and as president will complain that we're removing the hold harmless, and that he says that you're taking money from me. And sitting next to him is the president who really is her money, because she's the one who's been growing enrollments, and we equalize and make a pro-rata change. And so it's really a conversation within the governing board where it's let's all play this fair, and a pro-rata distribution, that's the way forward. Let's make the finance policy actually have meaning. It's a tough sell, though. Well, I think that's all we have to say. So, again, all this is on our website, and we're always available for questions. Call, email us at any time.